All right, today we move into our second branch of government, our second group of policymakers here. We are going to finally move on and deal with the presidency. So we're going to deal with the President of the United States, the powers that they have, the offices, all the people that support the President of the United States, and all of their influence on policy and how they interact with other branches. What we see here is Inauguration Day of President Trump, our 45th President of the United States. You can see his family there. You can see President Barack Obama in the background and his Vice President Joe Biden. You can see Chief Justice John Roberts off to the right administering the oath of office. And we'll get into all these ceremonies and stuff over the next couple weeks. So what we want to do today, we want to describe the provisions of the Constitution that deal with the president. If we go through the constitutional provisions about the presidency, we'll be able to explain how the president handles their day-to-day job. So we've got a lot to think about with the president. Of course, the president is just one person, but they're responsible for millions and millions of federal government employees and services for 330 million Americans. And so we want to find out how the president of the United States is able to run the government. So just like we did with Congress and what we'll do for all of our branches here, we want to start with the Constitution. We're going to go straight to the Constitution and find out what exactly it says about the office of the president, the powers that the president has, and all of the different restraints on the president. So we'll go through Article 2 of the Constitution, which sets up the executive branch. Before we get to the Constitution, we always want to check back on the Articles of Confederation and just remember what this branch would have been like under the Articles. So in the Articles of Confederation, you guys remember the only branch of government was the legislature, and there was no independent executive branch. That doesn't mean that there was not an executive, but the executive branch was not independent from the legislative branch. So the president, there was a president of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and that person was chosen by the members of Congress. So the members of Congress would get to vote on the executive, and the president of the Congress would serve in one-year terms as president of the Congress. They presided over Congress, and they had like administrative functions. So when we say administrative, I want you to think of like day-to-day operations, running it like a business. So dealing with budgets and hiring and firing and all that kind of stuff. There were actually 8 different people who served in this position. So we actually had 8 different presidents before we got to our first official president, George Washington. There were 8 people who served as president of the United States Congress under the Articles of Confederation. So when we write the Constitution, we want to look at the Constitution as a whole and think about what we can tell about the setup of the Constitution and the executive branch. This is Article 2, so we know this is the second thing set up in the Constitution. We implied a lot about Article 1 being about Congress, and we're going to do the same thing here with Article 2. This article is not as long as Article 1. The powers for the president are not nearly as specific. They're pretty vague. There's less of them than the powers assigned to Congress. Article 1 is much longer. Article 1 is first. Article 2 is a lot shorter. Article 2 is vague, and so we can suggest here that the framers of the Constitution expected the executive branch to be not as important as the legislative branch. They did not have a whole lot of experience with an executive that they were happy with. They were very fearful of a king-type government because they were fleeing the monarchy of England. So the powers of the president are pretty much open to interpretation here, and they spend a lot of time focusing on the limits on the president's power here. Much of what's in the Constitution here deals a lot more with how we would pick a president and how we would get rid of a bad president than it does deal with the day-to-day operations of the presidency. All right, so when we get into Article 2, it's split up into sections. We don't need to know these sections, but the first section here sets up the office of the presidency. It tells us that the president with the vice president is the head of the executive branch. And that's it. It's pretty vague here. It includes the vesting clause, which we've talked about before. It says all executive power is vested in the President of the United States. What exactly executive power means and what the limits on executive power should be are not clear by the words of the Constitution. So this just tells us that the president has all of the executive power. This also sets up the electoral college process. So it gives the state legislatures the power to decide how they choose their electors, how they're going to choose to give out their votes for the presidential selection process. This part of Article 2, where we deal with selection process, was later changed by the 12th Amendment. So we're going to look at what the 12th Amendment specifically says here. But this does set up the process where if no candidate gets a majority of the electoral college votes, then the House of Representatives has a role of choosing the President of the United States, and the Senate has the important role of choosing the vice president. This will also give us the official qualifications for president. So, for a person to serve as president, they must meet these three qualifications. They must be 35 years old, they must have lived in the United States for 14 years, and they must be a natural born citizen. Now, natural born is also pretty vague. We don't know exactly what that means or what the intention was here, but courts have routinely interpreted this to mean that they are a citizen at birth. That does not mean that they have to be born in the United States, although that is some people's interpretation of these words here. But a natural born citizen, the courts have defined this as a person who achieved their U.S. citizenship at birth. So if your parents were U.S. citizens, you are a natural born citizen. If you are born in the United States, you are also a natural born citizen. So there's lots of different ways to become a natural born citizen here and qualify for the presidency. All right, another pretty vague part of Article 2 that had to get clarified later deals with the vice president. Article 2 also has some vague descriptions of the vice president, and these had to be cleared up by a later amendment to the Constitution. But Article 2 says that the vice president takes over for the president if there is a vacancy. The vice president uh, is going to fill the role of the president in the event that we have a vacancy in that office. Now, this does not say that the vice president becomes the president of the United States. It does not say that the vice president will finish the president's term. The 25th Amendment later cleared this up. The 25th Amendment is the first time that the Constitution says that the vice president will become the president of the United States and that they will remain the president of the United States for the remainder of that term. The first time we had a president die was William Henry Harrison. He died a month into office. He got pneumonia on Inauguration Day and died a month later. His vice president was John Tyler, and John Tyler assumed the position of president. So he took on the title President of the United States. He did not become the acting president or anything. He just said, I'm the president of the United States. And he finished out William Henry Harrison's first term. And this created a precedent. This created an example. When he took on the title of President of the United States, nobody was really sure if that was what the process was supposed to be, but he did it. People let it happen. And so in the future, when other vice presidents had to fill in for the President of the United States, they followed this example here from John Tyler. So it was not until the 25th Amendment that the Constitution actually says the vice president becomes the President of the United States. All right, some more details from Article 2 here. Here's an important one. It's not going to seem like that big of a deal, but this is an important check for the president. So the president's salary cannot be changed during a term of office. That means that the president cannot be given a pay cut or a pay raise during their term of office. This is important because this prevents, since Congress decides how the money is spent, this prevents Congress from being able to reward or punish the president financially. So Congress cannot promise the president a raise if he cooperates with all their lawmaking. They cannot give him a pay cut if he vetoes laws and is uncooperative with Congress in other ways. So this is an important check for the president that we'll talk about a little more. Also, important details here: the president cannot be paid by any other part of the government, any part of the federal government, any part of the state governments, or foreign governments. So the president is not able to be, to hold any other offices at the same time or receive any compensation from any part of our government or other governments here. We don't want to create conflicts of interest for the president. So the framers were very worried about the president and their loyalty and making sure that the president could not be swayed with potential financial benefits. It also mentions that the president's term begins with an oath of office. That is how we kind of start a new presidential term. The inauguration and all the ceremony and all that comes along with a new president, that's all tradition. That does not have to happen. The only part that has to happen at the beginning of each term is the president is to recite the oath of office, and that signals the beginning of the president's term. Section 2 gets into the powers of the President of the United States. So, Article 2, Section 2 outlines the powers that the President has. Some of these are kind of vague, some of them are a little more specific here, but they're all over the place. They're not in any specific order. It goes right into the fact that the President is the Commander in Chief of the military. Again, that's pretty vague, does not tell us what the president can or can't do. It's kind of confusing since Congress has powers to raise and regulate the armed forces, and Congress has the power to declare war, but the president is the commander in chief, so the president is the decision maker for the military. It also says that the president can grant pardons. We'll get into those details a little later, but the president can pardon anyone from punishment for federal policies, so that these have to be federal crimes for the president to step in and pardon. He does not just get to pardon your average criminal at the state level. It mentions that with the advice and consent of the Senate, the president can enter into treaties and make appointments to the cabinet, judiciary, and the ambassadors. So this says that the president is able to appoint a variety of government officials, which we'll talk about a little more later, and the president can negotiate treaties with other countries, but he must get the consent of the Senate to complete these tasks. Section 3 deals with the responsibilities of the president. It doesn't list very many here, but one of these, this is in the Constitution. The president must report on the state of the union to Congress from time to time. So this is what we in modern times call the State of the Union address. This happens once a year. In more modern times, it's not necessary because the Constitution just says from time to time. They're not specific about how often. It does not specifically say that the president has to make a big speech or be before Congress or anything like that. In fact, our early presidents submitted these reports in writing, but now this is all a big tradition. So the president goes before both houses of Congress. This is one of their major speeches of the year. And what typically happens in the State of the Union address, it's not so much a report on how the United States is doing, but it's where the president is going to recommend major policy actions to Congress. So here they take advantage of being able to speak to Congress and to the American people in order to suggest different policy actions that they would like to see Congress take. So it now becomes up to Congress as to whether or not they will work together with the president to achieve those goals. But this is what the State of the Union address has turned into in modern times. Other ways that the president deals with Congress, the president has the power to call Congress into session. So if there's an emergency situation or something that the president must have Congress deal with, he has the power to call Congress and say, hey, get here and work on this or find a solution to this problem now. This typically happens at times of emergencies, like after Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt called an emergency session of Congress and asked them to declare war on Japan, that kind of thing. So this allows the president to force Congress to respond to a pressing situation. President also has the power to adjourn Congress, meaning that he can send Congress home. He can say, that's it. That's the close of business. You're not doing what I want. Although this power has never been used by a single president. So we don't actually know what this would mean or what this would do. But this is a power that the Constitution says the president has. No president has ever used it. And this is for the best. This helps keep our branches more separate here. Now, another important power that the president has is he receives the ambassadors from other countries, and that makes him in charge of diplomatic recognition. We'll explore that power in greater detail tomorrow so we can get a better understanding of what that means. But this gives the president the sole power to decide which government of each country is the legitimate government of that country as far as the United States is concerned. All right, more in Article 2. We talked about these back in Unit 1 when we were talking about how power expands, but these are some vague phrases about the president that help to give the president some version of elastic power. So it says the president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This is called the Faithful Execution Clause or the Take Care Clause. This basically says that the president can do whatever they need to do in order to carry out the law. And so this works as an elastic clause for the president. It states that it's the president's job to carry out the law. So even if the president disagrees with the law, it's up to them to carry out that law, to put that law into action. And so this gets us into some weird places and some situations that we've talked about before, like marijuana policy. Like, does the president have the ability to decide that they are not going to enforce marijuana laws in certain states? So it's the Constitution says it is up to the president to carry out those policies, even when they disagree with those policies. So a very important role of the president here in making policy into action. All right, Article 2, Section 4 sets up the impeachment process. So we've dealt with the powers of the president a little bit. We've dealt with the election of the president a lot. We definitely want to, the framers want to make sure and make a clear path to get rid of a president who is acting improperly. So the impeachment process is in Section 4. The president can be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Notice this is for criminal actions. So the president can be impeached for criminal actions. And that's not for political reasons. So the president does not get impeached because Congress disagrees with the president. The president is impeached if he commits an actual crime. So with President Trump, he was impeached for President Trump was impeached for attempting to I guess you could say, blackmail or extort a foreign leader in exchange for America's military aid. President Clinton was impeached for lying to a jury. These impeachments both took place basically for political reasons, but Congress needed an actual criminal act in order to begin the impeachment process. We've had 3 presidents impeached, but no presidents have ever been removed from office. The House is in charge of impeaching the president. They accuse the president of a crime. Any member of the House can start that process, and it just requires a majority vote. So if a majority of the House votes to impeach, the president is impeached. But in the Senate, the threshold is a lot higher. The Senate has a trial and votes on whether or not to remove the president from office, and it requires 2/3 of the senators to vote to remove the president. So the 3 presidents that have been impeached, Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, none of them have been removed by the Senate. All right, and then a couple of amendments after Article 2 here. First is the 12th Amendment. This came early because early on, the presidential elections were pretty messed up. The Constitution was written before political parties had developed in the United States, and once political parties developed, we realized that the election design was a bad election design. Originally, the members of the Electoral College would vote, and whoever got the most votes would become the president. Whoever got the second most votes would become the vice president. Now, in a system where one party presents a candidate and a party with opposite ideas presents another candidate, you're going to end up with a president and vice president that do not get along. So the 12th Amendment here fixes these problems. They create separate ballots for president and vice president. So each electoral college member votes for president, and they also vote for vice president. And this way, we do not end up with a situation where, for example, I guess based on this last election, Joe Biden would be the president and Donald Trump would be the vice president. We know that would not work as a leadership structure of the country. So these offices are made into separate offices, and this is because political parties formed. So once political parties took over the election process and organized voters to support specific candidates, we had to change the way elections were done. The 22nd Amendment comes after President Franklin Roosevelt. George Washington was the first president. He served 2 terms and decided to step down. Every president that followed him also stepped down after their second term. So no president chose to run for their 3rd term. Now, President Franklin Roosevelt was president during the Great Depression and then into World War II, felt that in such an emergency situation that stable leadership was important, and President Roosevelt was elected 4 times. After President Roosevelt was no longer president, Congress decided that we did not want that situation again, so the 22nd Amendment sets a 2-term limit on the president. Now we got to figure out some details here. So if a vice president becomes president, it depends when in the president's term they became president, if that counts as one of their terms or not. So if the vice president takes over in the first half of a president's term, if they serve more than half of that term, that counts as one of theirs. If they serve less than half, it does not count as one of theirs. So we have a situation where a vice president who replaces a president of the United States could serve a maximum of 10 years as president. Uh, if they became president just after the halfway point of the original president's term and then won 2 terms on their own, they could be president for up to 10 years. The 22nd Amendment and the 12th Amendment create a little bit of a problem here, one that's still unclear, one that we probably won't have to solve because it's hard to imagine a president agreeing to do this, but can a former president become vice president? Technically, they meet all the qualifications. They are 35 years old, they are natural born, all this. But since there is a maximum time served, we have a little bit of a dilemma here. So there's always been what if scenarios. What if like for example, what if President Obama decided to be Joe Biden's vice president? Well, technically, I guess that could happen. But Obama may or may not be able to replace Joe Biden as president if need be. So, just a weird scenario that we don't really have an answer to, but probably won't have to because it doesn't make a lot of sense for a person who's been president to decide to be vice president. All right, that's a lot. That is what the Constitution tells us about the President of the United States. There's still one more amendment. We're going to talk about the 25th Amendment, but that one's long and complicated, so we're going to talk about that separately. But now we've been able to look through what Article 2 says about the president and all the different things that the Constitution lays out for how the president's selected, how the president could be removed, and the powers of the president. Now we're going to look at the succession of presidents with the 25th Amendment, and we'll go on to talk about the different roles that the president fulfills.